Hi, I'm Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work, and life in a more successful and sustainable way. Hello, and welcome to this special episode of the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show. I'm your host, Nikki Lowe, and today I'm celebrating my 100th podcast episode. When I first launched my podcast back in May 2018, it was 6 weeks before my daughter was born. And I never imagined that I'd get to 100 episodes. I'd actually had a lot of doubts about putting it out into the world. Would anybody want to listen? Would anyone care what I had to say? Would people hate my voice? I was born in Dudley and brought up in and around that area. And the local accent is notorious for being one of the least attractive accents in the UK. So that was at the back of my mind. I was thinking, would I be able to show it consistently with valuable episodes for people? Well, it seems that I proved my inner critic wrong. Because when me and my team were discussing what to do for this 100th episode, we bounced quite a few ideas around. Maybe we do a montage of some of the most listened to episodes. Maybe we get someone to interview me, or maybe we get an important guest expert on. But then we decided the most important guest to have on this podcast is you, the listener. So this episode is dedicated to you, every single one of you that has given up your precious time to listen. Because celebrating the 100th episode isn't about impressing you. It's about impressing on you that we're not alone in this journey of being a working mother, that each of us is navigating the journey the best we can, and that we can't do it alone, and that having like-minded people who understand and can relate to our experiences are vital. And you've heard me say it before, but that it takes a village, either in person or virtually, to support, encourage and challenge us to walk our path as working mums with more ease and grace and doing it on our own terms. So when today's listeners join me to share their stories about the impact this podcast has had in their lives, it really brought home that I could easily not have launched this. I could easily have played small and safe. And if I had, then I wouldn't have been able to have the impact that I want in this world. And I actually wouldn't be able to make the difference that I am with this podcast. And that I wouldn't have been able to touch someone's life and see the ripple effects of that. So these stories that I'm sharing in this episode are not to impress you, but to impress on you that if you have something you want to do in this world, don't let fear stop you. And I hope you enjoy listening to your fellow listeners share their stories and feel connected to this wonderful Wisdom for Working Mums community, because I, for one, am so glad you're here. So let's hear from some of the listeners. Firstly, let's hear from Rowena, who is a listener to the podcast and has also become one of my coaching clients. So welcome, Rowena. Thank you so much for joining me on this 100th episode.
Hi, Nikki. Thank you for having me.
So I always think it's great that people get to understand kind of a little bit about who you are. So would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Rowena, and I'm a group strategy director for a FTSE 100 company. I'm an accountant by trade, but went into strategy and have been for the last 4 years. I've got a daughter who is just turning 4, and I work at home a lot, but I also commute into town and locally as well. And yeah, my other half works away during the week, so that makes it exciting for me, looking after my daughter and working during the week. And I also like to teach aerobics in my spare time. So, and I do that now for quite a big gym place. So I can't think of a way to say that. So yeah, that's only one class a week, but I really have to make time for that. It's really important to me.
Brilliant. That's a lovely overview, Rowena. And I've had the pleasure of meeting you actually through my podcast, I think is how we connected. And then you've gone on to be a client. So I've had the privilege of kind of getting to know you and your life. And and it's great to hear everything that you're combining in your life. So I want to know, when did you first discover the podcast, and how did you find it? Because I don't know if I ever asked you that when we first started working together.
No, so I have a very vivid memory of actually when I first discovered your podcast, and it was an extremely desperate situation because I'd just started back at work after having Tilly, my daughter, and I'd taken on this crazy new strategy role, and I was having one of those days where Tilly was probably sick and I just didn't know how I was going to do it all. And I remember I was sitting in a Starbucks drive-through and trying to get her to have a sleep in the back of the car, and I just frantically looking through my phone as to I just put in help working mum, because I love a podcast, and you came up and I was like, right, okay, let's do this. I'm going to listen to this while Tilly sleeps and maybe it'll say something that helps me, and then the rest is history. So yeah, it kind of made me go, oh, okay, there is a way through this. And then, as you say, you've helped me the whole time. It's been great, really helpful. So I got in touch and I feel honoured to be working with you. So yeah, it's been great.
Oh, Irina, I didn't know that story. And as you paint that picture, I think, you know, we've all been there. That car ride where you're trying to get your child to sleep, you're feeling like I just need the space. And oh, wow. So thank you for sharing that story. So what has been your favourite episode, and perhaps why?
Yeah, so I found this one quite tricky to answer because I think you've done so many useful episodes, but I would actually probably say the first episode that I listened to, which I'm pretty sure was like an intro episode that you did, and you talked about your history and your experience and some of the things that you'd gone through. And to be honest, in that moment when I was looking for help, that was more than enough help to just hear that someone else was or had experienced some challenges and that you were finding a way through it. So I always think about your first podcast as something that was really meaningful to me. But then coming right up to today, I would probably say your latest podcast came at a really poignant time for me because I just got some support to help me with everything outside of my corporate role. So some PA support, actually, just a couple of hours a week. And I was thinking about giving that up because of money and all those good things, because we're building a house. And I listened to your look back at 22, and you were sort of saying how bringing on help and support had really helped you and had made such a difference in your year in terms of how 22 had gone. And it stopped me from pedaling back and saying I don't need the PA support anymore. And actually that was a really critical moment for me. So yeah, I think there's a sort of general, I listen to your podcast and they always help with topical things that are very relevant, and they help me to feel like I'm not going mad, and particularly your coaching has done that. But some poignant moments are probably your first one and your latest one. So yeah,
thank you. It's like the circle of life, the beginning and the end, or hopefully it's not the end, the latest one isn't the end, but brings it back in full circle.
Yeah.
So I think you've alluded to some of this, but what impact has the podcast had on you and particularly your life as a working mum? So if you perhaps say where you were when you first listened to it to where you are now.
Yeah. So a massive support. I think podcasts as a tool are so helpful because they're so flexible in terms of when you can listen to them. And then I think just being able to check in on subjects that aren't always talked about, particularly at work or even in my own home, my other half, we don't talk about some of these challenges particularly well, and listening to you talk about some really difficult stuff, whether that's from, I don't know, I've had challenges with infertility, you've touched on that in some of your podcasts, to whether you should be getting PA support or, there's so much like imposter syndrome's big thing for me. Like I can't name all of them, but certainly it's felt like having a helping hand and friend throughout what has been a complete change in my life after having a child that I desperately wanted and thought would make everything amazing, which it has in some ways, but and in lots of ways, you know, I wouldn't want it any different, but it makes everything very hard, and you've really helped me through that. So, and the podcast has been a great kind of thing to lean on, particularly like with the coaching, which is very intermittent and that works well, but the podcast is something that's in my control and I can dip in and out of when I want to.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it has been an absolute honour to kind of walk alongside you and see your transformation of where you were when we first started. See you now, you know, you've recently been promoted again, and also, as you say, you've taken the step to combine, you know, a very demanding career and, you know, a gorgeous nearly 4-year-old and being the kind of prime carer that has to be the flex point in the family.
Yeah, I'm definitely the flex point for sure.
With doing something that just lights you up, as you said, your fitness teaching.
Yeah.
And to see you step forward and do that, and to show that actually you haven't had to overstretch yourself to do that. You've been able to combine it in a way that brings you joy and lights you up.
Yeah, it's a massive thing. And actually checking in with you and a lot of the stuff that I listen to, you talk about, you know, that making time for that 1 hour a week class that I teach feels like an unnecessary luxury sometimes, or even too much of a stress. You know, it's not all roses, but I know that, you know, when I go to sleep at night and I think about, am I kind of happy in my life? That is such a huge part of feeling happy is the wrong word, satisfied. Like, I don't believe that it's natural to be happy all the time, but I'm definitely more satisfied with life by having something in my life that is meaningful in that respect, that's just for me.
Totally get that. Yes. Well, I am so glad you found the podcast, and I'm sorry that you were in that situation to have to kind of Google the help, but I'm so glad you did, and to your continued success and fulfillment. And
oh well, no, and likewise, you know, you've just been so supportive and helpful, and I don't know what I would have done without you. So thank you. And I know you've come into my work as well, so you've kind of done loads to support me and lots of people that I know too.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. So thank you, Rowena. Next up, we've got Catherine. So when we invited listeners to join me on this 100th podcast episode, we gave them the opportunity to either be interviewed or to drop me an email with their feedback. And Catherine really kindly shared this feedback on email with me, and I'm going to share it with you now. So she says, "Hi, I'm Catherine, and I live in Yorkshire with my husband and son, who's 7 years old. I work part-time, 3 days, currently in human resources in higher education, having previously worked in financial services. I took 12 months maternity leave as I wanted to fully embrace the time I had and wanted to spend every precious moment with my new son. I'd suffered a great loss in losing my dad suddenly the year before my son was born, so my emotions were all over the place. I was grieving and my heart was broken, yet at the same time, I'd never felt so happy to welcome my son, and it felt so special that it was a boy, and what a wonderful boy he is. An absolute joy to spend my maternity leave with, but I also had a baby who never slept or napped, and although I loved my maternity leave and the time we spent together, when I returned to work after maternity leave in 2016, I hadn't prepared myself for how hard I would find the transition back to work and the pressures of juggling of being a working mum. I went back exhausted, sleep deprived, still very much struggling with the grief, and my son struggled to initially settle at nursery. So I had immense mummy guilt. I felt really lonely and lost and felt my life had been turned upside down. I questioned why I was struggling so much, and when other mums seemed to make it look so easy. And whilst other mums were telling me how much they wanted to be back at work, I found it really difficult. I didn't feel like that there was anyone I could talk to. My team had changed. I had a new manager. My role seemed different. And I felt I'd been out of it for just too long. I think it was probably more likely that I had changed. I struggled on for months feeling this way, but then decided it was time for me to put my negative experiences into something positive. So I decided to look at how working mums could be better supported at work. I reviewed the family policies, the manager's guidance. I interviewed returning parents to ask them about their experiences. I looked at whether I could induce a buddy system for returning mums. I went to an event in Manchester about parental policies and supporting parents, and it felt like a fate moment as I met Nikki Senyo, who features on podcast episode 9. I chatted to Nikki about the work she'd done, and it was after that I started working with Nikki, which was a wonderful experience. We worked together to introduce a program of parent mentoring at my organisation, and it was so successful. We helped a cohort of parents, and it felt so good to be part of something so meaningful. During this time, I also built a network of parents, and we all supported each other. I went on to set up a parent network for the company, and over 100 parents attended on a monthly basis. It was at this point Nikki suggested I follow you, and sent me to the link to podcast episode 9. And Catherine says that she first discovered the podcast in about 2016, 2017, and has been hooked ever since. I went on to read about your article about mother's guilt, which was like a light bulb moment for me. I could so relate to that. And I went on to share this with my parent network group, and we discussed it. You later did a session with my parent network group, which was really well received. And I asked her what has been her favourite podcast episode and why. And she said, I started to listen to your podcast and the self-care one really grabbed my attention. I realised that I was spending all my time running about and caring about everyone else and giving nothing to myself. I was taking on the day job plus the parent network and mentoring. Life at home was busy and I was still permanently exhausted and felt depleted of all energy and motivation. Episode 22 and 23 also appealed to me as I was struggling with my confidence, and imposter syndrome had really crept in at that time. I felt lost in my career and I'd lost sight of what I was good at. She said, I can't recall which podcast it was, but you shared your story of burnout, and it was around that time that I felt that I could be experiencing burnout and something was wrong, or more than being a mum level of tiredness. It was at that point I decided to take a career break, which later turned into voluntary redundancy. After what had happened with losing my dad, supporting my mum, bringing up a toddler, I recognised I needed some time out. Again, your podcast gave me the strength to do that and listen to my body. I decided to go to the doctor and get some tests done. And after being referred to a consultant, I was diagnosed with premature ovarian insufficiency, POI. And so I was told the shocking news that not only would I not be able to have any more children naturally, but that I was in perimenopause. I'm still dealing with the symptoms, managing new medication and coming to terms with not having any more babies, which hit me so hard. The pandemic then hit, and again, your podcast truly kept me going through those frightening times. So it was during my career break that I made some big changes. I decided to get healthier. I started cooking, gardening, growing vegetables, walking every day and spending quality time with my family. I particularly like the Batch Lady podcast and still batch cook now. And I'd have good and bad days. After 9 months, I got a new part-time job, but we've continued to struggle to balance being a working mum, family, health, well-being and career. And so many of your episodes have helped me reassure me that I'm not alone, and I've shared so many of your podcasts with my mummy friends. The Rushing Mums or the Rushing Women Syndrome episode really struck me, and since then I've really slowed down and been more aware of my behaviours. I'm continuing with my self-care too. Finally, one podcast that really struck me hard was episode 90 with Roisin. What an amazing woman. Oh, she is, isn't she, Catherine? Total inspiration. I was out doing my usual daily walk with my headphones, which is when I listened to your podcast, and I was feeling a bit sorry for myself. What a remarkable lady and journey. And after that episode, it gave me the kick I needed to really put things into perspective, and was so grateful and appreciative of the life I have. So I asked her what impact has the podcast episode had on her and her life as a working mum. And Catherine shared, I feel now with a combination of working part-time, making time for exercise and fresh air, self-care, recognising my limits and saying no, not comparing, slowing things down and appreciating life, I am much happier and feel I can be a better mum, daughter and wife. Thanks, Nikki, for all that you do. Your advice has definitely helped, reassured and supported me to be being a much better, happier working mum, and I'm sure you have supported so many other people too. Catherine, I am delighted to hear that the podcast has helped you on your journey, and thank you so much for sharing that. Next up, we have Dr. Esther Cole, who is a clinical director and clinical psychologist, and is also author of the book Psychological Therapy for Pediatric Acquired Brain Injury, and has won many awards for her work. Esther discovered my podcast and also went on to become a coaching client, and it's been an honour to support her on her journey as a working mum. So let's hear from Esther and her insights about the podcast. So welcome, Esther. It's great to have you back on the podcast. I don't get to say that to many people, but you're a returning guest.
I know, it's so exciting. Thank you for having me to celebrate your 100th episode. It's a really exciting milestone, and certainly one I'm going to really enjoy reflecting on in this session.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to have you and for you to give it your time to do this. So for those that may not have listened to our interview together, can you just share a little bit about yourself, perhaps your name, children, what age they are, and what your kind of situation is?
So my name's Dr. Esther Cole. I'm a clinical director and clinical psychologist at Lifespan Psychology, the diverse practice, which is a psychology practice that I set up on my own back in 2018, and it's grown with the support of Nikki and some other fantastic mentors, supervisors, and a great team. Since 2018 has grown, and we've won a couple of awards since then as well. The Prestige Award this year, and also the Early Career Award from the British Psychological Society in 2020, just before the pandemic.
She's fantastic. And so we actually got to know each other a few years ago. You reached out, didn't you? Because you've got, how many children have you got now? Is it 3 now?
Yeah, I forgot to tell you about them, didn't I, when you asked me to? So I am the proud mum of 3 amazing children who have literally kept me going through the really challenging few years that we've had. So they are 2, 5, and nearly 9. I have a boy and 2 girls. I approached you to help manage a really difficult time in 2019 when I became very ill, with a lot of sort of medically unexplained symptoms. And now, several years on, I do have a lot more answers, which has been really helpful medically. But while I was still trying to find my way to what the symptoms meant, this podcast was just unbelievable for all the insights and resources and people that I could actually go to who'd appeared on the show to help me along my journey of ill health whilst being a mum and also running my practice.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you found me and we connected. So yeah, at that point you'd got 2 children, and as you say,
I only had 2 at that time.
Yeah, and you were kind of building your practice and doing a phenomenal job, and you'd just written your book, and you were really suffering with your health, and it was that you reached out to kind of say, how do I do this? How do I continue to progress professionally whilst also showing up for my 2 children, but also manage my challenges?
Yeah, and it was actually really difficult at the time to connect with or find ways of connecting with other mums who also had health issues. And it really did help me feel less alone. And over the years, I've now been able to help my clients who are parents or who aren't parents, all my clients to manage stress, burnout, their workload, and kind of juggling different roles and the strains that come with managing lots of different roles. So I think this podcast has really helped shape that and my own experience and journey as well.
I love that you're taking your experience to be able to help others. So I'm curious, which has been your favourite episode or episodes, and why, of the podcast?
Well, the kind of most life-changing element for me, it wasn't necessarily my favourite podcast, not because Jo Gamble isn't amazing in herself, but I've in terms of my favourite to listen to, there'd probably be something different. But in terms of what I got the most out of your show is definitely Jo Gamble's episode. She's a functional medicine practitioner, and she's really helped me explore herbal medicine, particularly during the period where we didn't know what was wrong, before I had my kidney and my thyroid issues diagnosed. And Jo, I think what's been brilliant is that I've been able to explore herbal treatments alongside more traditional talking therapy and sort of more spiritual approaches as well. So it's kind of like really feeling like a holistic healing was going on, if that makes sense. And Jo was definitely like the herbal component of that.
Yes. And so for people that may not have listened to that episode, Jo was my functional medicine practitioner and is still my functional medicine practitioner. So she was the lady that helped me finally get my diagnosis of adrenal fatigue when I had my health issues. And when I decided to start the podcast, I knew I wanted to interview her and share her insights, because she's kind of forensic about helping anybody, but particularly women, understand what optimal health is. And if you're not experiencing that, really get to the bottom of it. And what she's done for mine and my family's health over the past 10 years has been life-changing. And it sounds like it has for you too.
Yeah, and it's almost like when I heard you mention her, I didn't believe it was going to work. And she uncovered a gluten allergy that I didn't know I was living with for years. A gluten, it was really quite serious. Since I've stopped eating gluten, my health has really kind of stabilized and improved. And had I not had her consultations, I wouldn't have known that I was allergic to gluten.
And you were very seriously ill, weren't you? I mean, you were incredibly...
I was bed-bound, hospital-bound, yeah, really in a bad way. I didn't think I'd work again. But in some ways, the silver lining is that what that meant is that I had so many referrals coming in for psychology sessions, and I myself was not in a fit state to be anybody's psychologist, physically or mentally. And that's kind of how my team developed, because I then had to found amazing psychologists who took the work on. So in some ways, my health has enabled me to take on board a lot more of your tips around, like delegation, time management, not feeling guilty if you can't do it all. So any of your episodes have kind of given women permission to not do it all. That has been so empowering for me. And I think because I've got the health issues to sort of fall back on, I can always say I can't. Maybe I needed that almost to not try and do it all.
Yeah, it's often the case, isn't it? It's not until we hit that brick wall that we kind of go, something's got to change.
But yeah, it shouldn't necessarily happen like that. I think it's great that you're getting the word out that these kind of these different versions of womanhood. I think it's your kind of most latest piece of advice, around the independent woman who wants to kind of do it all and can't ask for help. I'm definitely someone who I ask for help, and if someone says no, I'll go to the next person, and
that was not the case before, was it?
I think I was always very collaborative in style. I absolutely love working with people. But yeah, I think I wanted to do a lot more than I physically could always, and found it really hard to say no. And so it's really great you've got an episode on saying no. Yeah, it's hard to pick a favourite because I'm obviously a fan and listen to most of your episodes, and it's kind of like just a general theme of what you kind of the advice that you share, the wisdom that you share, that I just find really helpful for all my clients, whether they're parents or not, whether they're men or women.
Brilliant. So what would you say the impact of the podcast that it's had on you and your life as a kind of business owner, psychologist, working mum?
Oh, so many things. So I didn't get to mention Laura Coleman either, who has been the only person who has enabled my kind of I don't really, I know we talked about type A personalities, didn't we, in our coaching sessions, Nikki, and I can see myself in that. And I think Laura identifies as that too, but just somebody who's quite hard to switch off, who maybe has perfectionist tendencies, who works really hard and so on. She's the only person that's been able to connect me with meditation. And that was really, really powerful, because I've been able to do that even for, she says, you can do it for 5 minutes a day. In reality, I enjoyed doing it so much. And she taught me, and this was just through her YouTube videos, she just taught me to be able to take that time out. And I end up meditating a lot more than 5 minutes a day. And your episode on micro transitions as well kind of enabled me to put that into practice when you're going between lots of busy things, being able to kind of put in that meditation as well. And I think the impact is that I'm doing more, but spending less time on it, which is just phenomenal. I don't know how I managed to do that, Nikki, but I think the wisdom that I've taken from it has enabled me to achieve more, but have more time for my family, which I think is nothing short of a miracle, really.
Oh, that makes me so happy to hear. I can talk about it and I say this, but people kind of, when you're in that place where we both started, you just don't think that's even possible. It just feels like that's just marketing. Yes, you don't believe that it's possible, but I see it with so many of my clients that they kind of step up their careers, they're achieving more, they're having more impact, but they're not having to use more of their willpower or energy to do it. They just do it in a much more sustainable way.
Yeah, and it does sound too good to be true. But obviously, I'd hit that rock bottom and needed to, at that point, I was receptive. But what I really like is that I'm able to tune into my clients better and understand kind of how much their readiness to sort of buy into that idea. So I can now, there's kind of two parts to it, think more strategically about where I want lifespan psychology to go in the future. What organizations am I now going to work with to develop it in a different way, to expand in a different way? So taking that step back enables me to be more strategic and to kind of get more out of it in the shorter time, but also being able to manage my own diary. I can actually say, I don't feel well today, or I know that next week is going to be a bad week because I've got lots of things planned, so I need to make sure I take a day out for myself. I can actually preempt in my schedule the time that I need to take back for myself or my family, which I couldn't have done if I had just been trying to do absolutely everything all the time.
Oh, I love that awareness, and that you're able to manage yourself and your life in that way. Well, Esther, thank you so much for joining me to share our journey and the impact that that's had. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I really appreciate being on the podcast twice. And also, I really enjoyed downloading How Does She Do It? You had like a How Does She Do It summit. And what I absolutely loved about that is that you were showing women who were exceptional, but who were showing you how they did it in like the most basic things that just made their lives sustainable and their lives work. And it felt really human and really accessible. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'll put a link if people are interested in what that is in the show notes of this, so people can see what you're on about. But I interviewed 5 different women, didn't I, that had, incredibly successfully careers in their own right, but in very different industries, in very different roles. One was a GP, one was a CEO, a number of different, one was a finance director. And they just pulled back the curtains and talked about how they actually have the success that they have, but do it in a sustainable way.
And can I also thank you for bringing in really subtly but really powerfully the sort of anti-racist dialogue as well, and allyship. I think you've done that really in a really thoughtful and just in a really thoughtful and accessible way again. And it's really meant a lot to me as a woman from Afro-Caribbean background. And your response during the time that George Floyd was murdered. So I really appreciate your response at that time as well.
Thank you, Esther. That really means a lot, because it's something that's often on my mind, that there is always more that I need to learn about my own unconscious bias and be more of an ally. So I really appreciate that feedback, that I'm on the journey, but I can't see more that I want to do.
Absolutely. It was just so refreshing having those discussions with you and hearing your podcast as well, because I can really hear it will make such a difference, maybe in the longer term than in the short term, but I think it's really powerful to start having these conversations.
Thank you, Esther. Next up, we hear from podcast listener Laura Morgan, who kindly also emailed me her feedback. And she says, "My name is Laura Morgan. I'm a 32-year-old new mum working in the facilities management sector. I've been in the industry for around 10 years, and my roles include managing contracts and quite large teams of operational staff. I'm full-time and returned to work after 3 months on my first child and 5 months on my second. I'm 10 years married and have 2 lovely boys. Sebastian is 2 and Tobias, who is 6 months old. My husband is a police officer, and we very much share the parenting load, or guarding cover, as we call this part of parenting. However, as we hear all too often, my role at home, the parenting prep workload, is very much all mine. The nature of my job, combined with lockdown, meant that it was quite difficult to find maternity cover for me, particularly with my eldest son, Sebastian, being born. For this reason, I returned quite soon to work. My personal guilt crept in, knowing it was causing others to be stretched, and I can now see I had full control over this. However, I wouldn't be told otherwise. I felt it was my duty to go back and support the business I worked for through this tough time, not understanding the full implications this would have on family life. I would spend all day supporting people and answering questions to sort out quite large problems, to then come home to a whole new set of questions and support needed for me. On return after baby 1, I was fortunate enough to work from home on occasions for a few weeks. However, the toll that this took on me mentally was tough. Teams I managed, and also my husband, would say, "You're working from home," in brackets. I can honestly say that those weeks were the most I've ever worked. I was working from the first feed at 5 a.m. through to midnight, juggling meetings with childcare as nurseries were closed and our parents at the time weren't allowed in the house. I was working around 70 hours a week, compensating for the guilt I had, knowing that I had to take 30 minutes out to do a feed. My husband was continuously having rest days cancelled and being sent away with the protests around Black Lives Matter. And at one point, I remember being extremely overwhelmed and thinking, this isn't how it was supposed to look. The only place I could take Seb was a supermarket. No classes or groups were running. And after having my second, I realised how much this affected him. I would get up at 4 a.m. and go into our garage gym just to give myself the opportunity to pull back control and focus. However, this started to burn me out and resentment struck. I could see that I was becoming bitter. I would do everything myself, and this really wasn't healthy. My manager was and is fantastic and really did support my return to work. However, my personality was one that couldn't show failure and needed to be successful at everything I had going on. I could see negative impact this was having on my home life and my work attitude. I found out around this point that we were expecting our second child, which was quite a shock. However, I think Toby really was a blessing. He gave me the strength to get through the next 9 months and has really shaped the future of my career. I had 5 months off with Toby, and at the point of requesting maternity, I was still in the mindset of the business couldn't cope with me being off, and I had to do everything myself. This was one of the biggest hurdles I needed to conquer unknowingly at this point. My husband once said to me, "If this country was under threat, you would run to make sure the business was fine." This horrified me, but was probably true. Returning to work after Toby was born is where it all changed. And I asked her where she first discovered the podcast, and she said, so I had around 2 weeks to go before starting back, and the boys started with our childminder. We also engaged in nursery 2 days a week to allow me to focus days at work. I was at this point petrified of going back to work and falling into the trap of how I was before going on maternity leave. I was already listening to podcasts on running and training, so searched Spotify for women in leadership roles. I started to listen to a few, most of which primarily were American women, and I found their lifestyle and attitudes really hard to resonate and relate to, so I took a break from them. When looking for kids' rock songs one morning on the nursery run, Wisdom for Working Mums came up on my recommended list, so I dropped the boys off, and en route to one of my kit days, I listened to your very first podcast and thought, this podcast was written about me. How do they know all this? Little did I know that there are a lot of mums out there facing these pressures. The next day, my routine became train if it was my turn, grab a coffee, put a podcast on for my 45-minute commute. Usually my commute involved a call to a mum, and we would collaboratively moan to one another the whole journey. I found that listening to the podcast meant I wasn't having the daily communication with my mum, which I was really missing. However, there was a definite change in my moods when I was moaning to when I had the podcast. So I started to split the week up. Monday, Wednesday and Friday were podcast days. Tuesday and Thursday, mum catch-ups. And I vowed to make these more positive and not offload all of my problems onto my mum for 30 minutes. I also replaced the other 3 mornings with booking some things in that were nice for us to do, opposed to dropping the kids off to her or ranting about life on the phone. When I started back, I put in place plans, this time to cover my role between 3 people on temporary promotion positions. I was shocked to return and find that this was working and everything was going fine. For the first day or two, I really felt like I wasn't needed, which was a really unusual experience. I cried dropping the boys off while my oldest was crying after having 5 months at home with me. The guilt really struck me that I was leaving them with people to go and work, and while new friends' mums had another 6 or 7 months off, another manager really lightheartedly said, "Oh, everybody's been doing a great job. You're not needed anymore." This really hit hard. I remember leaving the office to have a good cry. I have left the 2 people who really need me to be here and told that, why have I done this to myself and my family? And it was only me to blame, and I needed to change things. At this point, I was listening to the podcast, The Underestimated Power of Saying No, and developing healthy habits to avoid generosity burnout. One of my worst traits is to do everything myself and say yes to everything. I really struggled to stop doing this, so instead started to stay quiet. So when a call for help to work that extra day or request for someone to take on another project came up, the first few times I felt eyes moved to me, but after a few uncomfortable seconds, my newly promoted team took up the requests. I knew they had the capacity to, and me staying quiet supported them to do this. I started to pull out of meetings that they were going to. Why was I intending to step in and take control when they were there and capable of making the decisions? I started to respond to the usual last-minute urgent requests at 4:45, needing to be done that evening, leaving me late on the nursery pickup. With, unfortunately, I don't have this capacity to do right now, but we'll put some time in on whenever to take a look at this. The first few times caused some very upset responses, but it left people then needing to take responsibility and give more notice to request information in more time, which has been a huge help to my role. It has also reflected across the team and allowed the department to work more effectively and efficiently. I have for the last 10 years worked all of the hours under the sun, saying yes to everything and doing everything myself. Listening to the podcast has allowed me to work smarter and more efficiently, supporting my work-life balance and precious time with my children. I do my hours and only my hours. I delegate and I trust. I challenge unkind or unhelpful behaviour, and I champion the support of working mums returning to the office. From listening to your podcast, I recently reached out to 10 other mums in the business, sharing some really helpful tips, which I didn't realise no one knew. We have free parking in the area. You can save your £5 a day for a hot coffee treat on your way in. Tax-free childcare account to help with those nursery fees. And last but not least, to listen to your podcasts. We catch up regularly and help one another through those struggles that really take a toll on the guilt that comes with being a working mum. I've worked in so many companies where women battle one another for promotion or attention, and it's so disheartening to see. These podcasts really show you how invaluable female relationships are. Being a mum is a unique experience that really does shape your life. It's not leaving anyone not on that path out. It's just pulling on those that are in it for support and lived and shared experience. I have the fortunate experience of 21 being diagnosed with thyroid cancer. I'm 10 years in remission, but recently experienced a scare that it had looked like it had returned from my appointment. I went straight to work, popped my earphones in and replayed the story of cancer, courage and hope. The shift was tough, but after I finished, I wrote myself a letter of all the things I would do, promises I made myself if my results came back negative. 5 mentally torturous days later, my results came back and the results were negative, and I continue in remission. I say that I was fortunate to have this experience because so much as I would never wish it on anyway. 1, the realization and the wake-up call that this situation gives you is like no other. I can genuinely say when the children are screaming and fighting that I just appreciate hearing it. I'm sure as time passes that feeling will change, but I'm grateful of every day, and should the worst happen, my job would have gone to someone else, and a few months later things was resumed. My family's life, however, would have been impacted forever. So this is where my time and energy needs to be focused. The podcast listened above have given me so much of the biggest tools to make changes. I did, however, love the batch cooking episode. I just need to find the time to organise my shopping list to do this. I also love the story of collagen, which one day I'm hopeful I can share such a successful story. I try my hardest to keep control of everything. However, when I do find myself getting a little feisty in work or at home, I know it's time for a podcast. It's often on the drive home where my to-do list is getting bigger and bigger, and I tell myself, you need to listen to Nikki. I'm just hopeful I don't run out soon. Oh, wow, Laura. Thank you for sharing your story. I am so grateful that your results came back in a really positive way for you and that it's reminded you of what's most important in life. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. Next up, we have Stacey Price, who is a listener to the podcast show. And Stacey and I actually had an introduction through a friend and colleague of mine into her organisation. And I was asked to come in and have a chat with them about working with this organisation. And Stacey made me aware in an email when we were trying to organise the meeting that she was a listener to the podcast and actually shared really powerful insight into how the podcast has impacted her life and her organisation. And it blew me away because I would never have known that the podcast had had that impact. So I asked Stacey if she would join us to share that story with you. So let's listen to Stacey. So welcome, Stacey. Thank you so much for joining me on this special episode.
Thank you, Nikki. It's lovely to be here.
So I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and so people can get a context of you and your life.
So my name's Stacey Price and I'm Senior Commercial Manager for a construction company. I have over 22 years now experience in the construction industry. And I'm also mum to Alfie, who was 8, and Bobby, who was 5. And my husband and I, we both work full time. A mutual friend of ours, Nikki, introduced us, who I work with also at Langerock. And it was just such a strange coincidence because I had been listening to your podcast for a number of years. So it was a real fangirl moment when James said, I'm going to hook you up with Nikki and let's talk about what you're both doing for mothers and for women who are working.
Yeah, no, that was a really interesting moment, wasn't it? Because we got introduced and you were like, oh my God, I know Nikki. And what was so lovely to hear from you, and I've said this so many times over the time of running the podcast, is I put these episodes out into the world and they kind of go out into the ether and you don't know who listens and what impact they have. And that's why we wanted to do this for the 100th episode. And when you shared with me the impact that the podcast had not only had on you, but then what you'd done with that and the impact it had on others, I really wanted to bring you on to kind of share that, because I think what you're doing is phenomenal for other working parents, particularly working mothers. So would you mind kind of firstly sharing, how did you find the podcast? How did you come across the show?
So I almost remember the exact moment, to be honest. It was back in 2018, and I'd just returned from maternity leave with my youngest boy, straight back into a full-time role on a multi-million-pound hospital development. And to be honest, I was drowning. I was really feeling the impact of being full time, having 2 children at home, and doing the big commute in and out to work 5 days a week, dropping the boys off in the pitch black dark, because this was around about December 2018. Dropping them at nursery in the dark, picking them back up again in the dark, hot wheeling at home on 2 wheels to get back in time for nursery closing at 6:15 on an evening. I was just absolutely drowning, and I was desperate, and I was on the verge of thinking, can I do this anymore? And this was a job that I loved and I'd had a really long career in prior to having the boys. And there was so much that I wanted to do, but it had just got me to that point where I thought I can't do all of this together. So I remember I was sitting in a traffic jam, going into Newcastle. We were being sat there for about 20 minutes, and I was looking at podcasts and looking at what could help. One of my best friends, she's also now a life coach, actually. She was a massive avid listener of podcasts, and she kept telling me about all these different ones to listen to, and I never had the time, and I never really paid a great deal of attention. But at this stage, I was just looking for somebody to help, and I was Googling helping working mums survive, and it actually brought up your episode. And I was also Googling podcasts for working mums, and all of these other mum podcasts came up, but nothing, the only one that really stood out to me was yours, because it said wisdom for working mums. And it came up, and it must have found you because I'd put in surviving for surviving motherhood, and it actually came up with your episode, which was with Joe Gamble. Way back when you had actually said in your introduction, Joe had helped you transform from merely surviving to thriving. And although that podcast was very much about health and nutrition, the fact that I'd been able to search and had found that sentence from you in the podcast introduction is what got me starting listening to your podcasts. And then it just continued from there, really, Nikki.
Oh, wow. I hadn't heard you share that before, Stacey. So it's really touched me to hear that, because interestingly, when I've asked people this question for this 100th episode, quite a few of the guests have said, I can remember the exact moment that I was in that place of desperation and I just needed somebody or something that got where I was at. It sounds such a visceral thing, and I remember that experience myself, and I remember finding a specific resource when I was struggling. And so it's just lovely to hear that the show has had that impact on you.
It really did.
It was interesting because when we first connected through work, I remember you saying that there was a particular episode that you took and then implemented in your workplace. And that really struck me as well, because the ripple effect of that. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that episode and what you then went on to do?
Yeah, so that episode was talking about, my favorite episode will always be that one that I logged onto that morning, and it just made so much sense to us and gave me that sense of comfort going into work that morning. It was a dark morning. I was crossing the Scotswood Bridge. I remember it so vividly. It's strange. Then from there, I was getting excited, getting back into the car in an evening or in the morning to get the podcast on. I had to drive for like an hour into work every day and an hour home. And I just listened to your podcast both ways, and it just made me feel better, to be honest. It was then later that year, so January 2019 was just before we went into the pandemic, wasn't it? And to be honest, just before, leading up to that pandemic, that's when I was feeling at my most desperate and out of my depth. And like, I just couldn't juggle everything. And I was listening to one of your podcasts driving in about this, again, talking about thriving and not just surviving as a mother. But actually, it was a man who your podcast was about. And actually hearing it from his point of view made me really sit up and listen. It was a podcast episode entitled "The Perspective of a Working Father." Brian Ballantyne, and he just shared his insight into parenthood and what was traditionally a female-dominated topic, really. And he talked about his first-hand experience of discrimination at work against women, and just shared his perspective as a working father, and what he was doing to help support working mothers to thrive. And I work in a very male-dominated industry, in the construction industry. Often on my projects, I'm the only woman on the project. And I knew that there was other men out there like Brian who I worked with. I knew that there was other men who were fathers and who would have wives that worked like me, but we weren't really speaking up and supporting each other. And in listening to Brian, I thought, I know that there'll be people at Laing O'Rourke that will help support each other. So I reached out. It was just before the pandemic, and I reached out to the head of our health and wellbeing team and said, look, we have all of these diversity and inclusion subcommittees. However, I feel like there's a big gaping hole, because we have one for LGBT plus, we have one for our we have a gender committee, we have a carers committee, we have a disability forum. We don't have a one for working parents. And she said, you're right, like the majority of the people who I work with are parents, but nobody was really talking about that. We came to work like we didn't have children. We came to work as though we hadn't just been through the crazy marathon of the morning, getting them ready for nursery and getting out of the door that the majority of us have been through every morning. So I reached out on our internal social media platform and said, are there any other working parents out there who would like to get together and like to talk and support each other and see what initiatives we can come up with to help support other working parents in our business. And we now have, slowly people started to join the group, and we now have over 170 members in that community. And it's just gone from strength to strength.
That's phenomenal. And am I right in thinking that you've won awards for the work that you're doing in this space?
I have, yeah. So last year I was nominated for a Women in Construction Award, and went down to the lovely event in London at the end of last year and won the Female Industry Pioneer Award, which was lovely. And that was to recognise somebody who had saw a gap in a market or created a new opportunity in their current field, and for a person who's gone above and beyond in that sector or in their sector to better the environment for those around them. And I couldn't think actually of, that's a lovely award to win, because that does sum up how a lot of the feedback that I get from people in the group, that it's just made them feel much more included as a employee of Laing O'Rourke, but also as a working parent. That these parents, we all have a voice now. People know who the parents are in our business. They know what our directors' children look like. They know what their colleague, how many children their colleagues have, because we've given ourselves a voice. We've shared pictures of our family, our different situations online together in our social platform on Yammer. And we've just made the company, well, it's a family company anyway, and we've made it even more family orientated by giving a voice to our working parents.
I love that. It's like you're all parenting out loud now rather than kind of it being something that's just left out of the work system.
We
I mean,
are we are now coming to work like we do have children, Nikki, and before we were coming to work like we didn't.
yeah. And just you can show up as a whole person then, how healthy is that? And from a well-being perspective, knowing that, yeah, I belong here as a working parent.
Totally. And when people would be frightened to say like, oh, I need to leave early for parents' evening or a doctor's appointment for my child, people aren't worried about saying that anymore because we are just so more open and honest about the fact that we have children, and we've got them through the working parents community. We've got our children more involved in the business. We've had family fun days where the children have all been invited. We had a month in July where our community was celebrated by the business, and we shared pictures of us with our family and the fact that we were working parents, whether we were full-time, part-time, job shared, whether we parented alone or we parented as a couple, or whether you were a grandparent and helped with the parenting of your grandchildren. We just shared all of that online and gave a face and a name to everybody. And again, that's just, it's really opened up everybody's networks at Langerock as well. So so many more people, which is so useful in your day-to-day role as well.
Yeah, massively so. Oh, just huge kudos to you for doing that, because going from that place where you felt stuck and thinking, can I actually do that, to where you are now and the impact you've had on others is just huge.
It is huge, but it did come from that inspiration of listening to somebody else who was in my position, who had felt like me. And that was through listening to you on the podcast, and then listening to the likes of Brian, who was very open about his situation and about what he did at work, that made me just realize that I wasn't the only person who felt like this. And that's, I think, when that's what empowers you to do something, because when you don't feel like the only person who's feeling this way, that there's other people out there that do. It makes you feel like you can achieve things as well.
That's phenomenal. So in terms of where you would say you are now then, so if you go from like December 2018 to now, what is your life like now as a working mum? I imagine, it's not plain sailing by any means, because it never is for us as working mums, but how different is it?
Oh my goodness. It's, I must say, as much as the pandemic brought an awful lot of sadness and suffering for a lot of people, it was actually, in my industry, a godsend for us who were working parents. I was traipsing and I was driving in Newcastle and back daily. I now work from home the majority of the time, which is just absolutely turned things on its head for me. I can be there to drop the children off at school on a morning. I can be there to pick them up on a night. My husband and I, we share the pickups and drop-offs now. We don't we don't have to always rely on breakfast clubs, after school clubs and grandparents. We can actually be there, which is so important. It's not just the fact that you need somebody to drop them off. It's the fact that you're there and you're seeing the friends and you're speaking to the teachers. It's massively important, when they're at infants and junior school. It's so important to be there and to be part of that school community with them. I'm here if one of them is ill, or we need to be flexible around the days when they have time off. It's just so much better. Working from home became obviously more of the norm during the pandemic, and a way forward. And that's something that my company have kept a hold of. And it's something that we're all pushing, to keep a hold of as well, because it's had so many benefits. We still get together, we still go into the office, and we have workshop days and meetings where we all need to be together. But being able to work from home has completely changed things for me. And as the working parents community at Langerock, that is something that we've put things in place to make sure that we don't go back to the way things were, because they weren't that great to start with.
Brilliant. Absolutely love that. And so I really appreciate you coming on, Stacey, and sharing your insights with us. And just thank you for the work that you're doing in the world, because it's making such a difference to other working parents.
Oh, thank you, Nikki. And thank you for your podcast, because I can literally, pinpoint that moment when it did save me from feeling completely alone in this job of being a parent and trying to balance a career that you love as well. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Next up, we have podcast listener Rianne. And Rianne kindly agreed to come and have a chat with me about listening to the podcast. So I'd never met or spoken to Rianne. I had actually seen her email in my community and commenting on social media. So it's really lovely to connect with Rianne and hear her story and get to know the person behind it. And I can't wait to share this with you. Welcome. Thank you for joining me and sharing these insights with me for this special episode.
Thank you for having me. Very excited.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about you, if you wouldn't mind just sharing kind of perhaps your name, where you're from, what your kind of life situation is, because that would be great to kind of put it in context.
Yeah, no problem. So my name's Rian. I am a mum of 3 children. They are 7, 5 and 1. And I work as a head of client services for a recruitment company, which I was very much part of the setup for the function that I manage and oversee. So I'm based in Cardiff, and I'm a mother who very much goes back to work quite quickly after having a child. So and I think for me, and obviously I know you're probably going to it further, but a lot of your podcast actually was spent whilst actually I was returning to work and that transition back. And so I took some really key bits of information from that, because I think as you've explained several times in your podcast, is that transition is huge, and especially as a mum and a working mum, I found it really beneficial.
And I suppose you've got insights of doing it 3 times, because we assume that the first time is going to be the hardest. And I found with clients over the years, it's not always the case. So yeah, you've got 3 experiences of that, which I imagine massive insights from that. So I'm always curious. So when and how did you first discover my podcast?
To be honest, it wasn't referred to me. It came up as, on Spotify. It's through Spotify, and it just came up as a suggestion. So I just clicked, and it was working mums, and it was something, I think it was during my 3rd, so the final child I'm having, I put that there now, final, during lockdown as well. So again, in lockdown, very different experience. So I never really leaned towards podcasts before. So it was very much about, for me, it was more music, and I just took my headphones in. But actually, I was struggling 3rd time round. And so to see that, obviously I've been searching things to be suggested, and I clicked it. And then I was hooked from the first episode I heard. I don't think it was the first of yours, but an episode, it was about your adrenal fatigue and on there, and that was really important, and it was obviously really struck a nerve with me. So I mean, not adrenal fatigue, but the dietitian piece. So feeling, as you do as a mum returning to work, it was very much, you feel weight gain and just feeling low about you're not really yourself and feeling a bit lost. So that, for me, that was the episode that got me hooked.
It's interesting. I'm always fascinated by that, because it's so individual what kind of hooks people in. So that was your first episode. Which has been your favourite, and perhaps why?
There was one you did, actually. I think a real key one for me was, you had a lady, I think she must have been Australia, somewhere across the globe somewhere, because I remember hearing that you were trying to accommodate the time difference, sorry. And the lady mentioned about getting a cleaner. And the reality of, actually, why are you spending your time doing that when you could benefit your business or your working life and your motherhood and that role by employing someone else to do that? And I haven't done that yet, but it is on my to-do list. To me, and actually, just what it did, it provoked thoughts around, I could just think in other ways, and actually not feeling guilty for thinking that either, and that lady and between the conversation you were having, a lot was resonating with me, and that was a real key piece that I took away. So for me, that was probably my favourite. And then I think throughout the kind of the vein that throughout all of them is your honesty with everything, which for me, I think is that humility to admit, this is hard. It really is hard. and then talking about you being really honest about your parents and things like that. And I'm going through more recently a parent with cancer, and all of that kind of just really sat with me. And I think that was really warming to hear you throughout all of them.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. So, yeah, that's really lovely. Thank you. In terms of the impact the podcast had then, and it sounds like it's a continual thing that like just you take something from particular episodes, what would you say the impact has been for you?
I think it's been that reassurance and always having that friend who's you don't know, but you always it's that, it's things like it's a comfort blanket now, your podcast to me. I think it's that, I've been sat in my car and the baby has taken a swim in, and it's been bloody hard work, for 20 minutes in the pool, the 2 hours either side, and the fight and the battle with her. And she finally gets to sleep, and I'm sat there, and I put your podcast on. I don't move the car. I think I'm just going to enjoy this because it's for me, it's for my mental well-being. And I think, yeah, for me, it's been that. It's that having that friend who maybe when your mum friends aren't available, you've got somebody. It's that familiar voice, I suppose, that you've become in my world.
Oh, that means the world to me. And the fact that you're using your precious time, because, 3 children, a demanding career, that you're using your precious time in that way just means the world. And thank you for inviting me into your world to be able to do that.
Being so honest and just letting me feel okay to be honest about how I'm feeling. So yeah, thank you as well.
Oh, real pleasure. And thank you for sharing that. As part of this 100th episode is all about just getting the insights of what's happened over these 100 episodes. Because when I first put it out, I wasn't sure if anybody was going to listen, if I got anything that people wanted to listen to, whether I'd have the stamina to kind of keep going. So the fact that it has, and it's had that impact just, means everything. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to the other listeners on this special 100th podcast episode. And I want to remind you how easy it would have been for me to not have put this podcast out into the world, to let my fear hold me back. And I've come to realize in life that there's 2 types of fears: the functional fear that's there to truly protect me, and the dysfunctional fear. And making sure that we don't let the dysfunctional fear hold us back. And if you want a little tip on knowing the difference between functional and dysfunctional fear, my little tip for you is notice where the fear sits. If it sits in your mind, it's often dysfunctional. But if it sits in your body, the chances are that it's functional. That's that fear response that tells you, actually, this isn't safe, so take care. But fear in our mind is often itty bitty shitty committee, as I like to call it, trying to trip us up. So please take this as your friendly reminder to not listen to that itty bitty shitty committee when you want to challenge yourself to step outside your comfort zone and have an impact in this world. Because listening to today's podcast guests who share the impact this podcast has had on them, it's been a really moving experience for me. And I would never have known the impact it had if these people hadn't offered to share. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story, because I've said it before, when I put this podcast out into the world and it goes out into the ether, I don't know who listens and what the impact it has. So I'm really grateful for those who share. And I want to finish this episode with a few special thank yous. When I first thought about launching this podcast, I had no idea where to start. And it was in a conversation with a colleague and friend, Faye Blakey. She recommended speaking to her husband, John. And if it wasn't for that introduction, this podcast would probably never have happened. So thank you, Faye. And John became my podcast editor and literally made this podcast happen. Took me to buy my microphone and recording equipment and helped me understand the technical side of hosting a show, because I just found that all so overwhelming. And he's edited every single one of these 100 episodes and designed the jingle. So thanks, John. You're part of the magic of this show, and I really appreciate you and everything that you do. And also to Laura, my podcast manager, who makes the magic happen behind the scenes. She books the guests and she really shares this out into the world, so it wouldn't get out there without Laura's support. And I just really appreciate having her on the team. And also to Lauren, my business manager and wing woman, who sits brilliantly and gracefully in the wings, making me look far more professional and brilliant than I am. So thank you, Lauren. And to every single one of my guests who have given up their time to share their insights, I'm hugely grateful. But also, and mostly to you, my friend, for listening to this show and being part of the journey. I'm more grateful than you'll ever know. So celebrate this special episode with me. Come join me in the celebration. I'd love to hear from you on this 100th episode. Drop me an email, a DM, or a review. I'd love to hear how you discovered the podcast and which has been your favourite episode and why. So thank you. If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too, so if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.